60 years ago last month, the Beatles almost sacked Paul. 60 years ago last month, Astrid and Stu were already wearing each other's clothes. 60 years ago last month, George Harrison turned 18. Yeah. Welcome to 1961 as we walk in the Fab's boots 60 years ago last month.
Beatle 60 is an independent, unofficial study group. We're not experts. We're like diligent students.
We follow their experiences in real time. In these monthly podcasts, I'm simply telling you what I learned in the past month. This month, we're looking back at the month of February 1961. Now, here is this month's special insight. Are you ready? Okay, here it is. Here it is. Unlike their first rough residency in St. Pauli, Hamburg last year, 1960, this year, 1961, they are much better prepared, better positioned. They're going to do really well. I know it. They know it. You know it. It's so they're still in Liverpool now, and just sooner than 1 month from now, they're going to leave Liverpool and spend 3 months at the top 10 club in Reeperbahn. And they know that this is going to happen. Now they know it. They know that the pay will be better. They know that their visas and work permits are sorted. They know the people at the club, the other musicians, the manager. They know that the sound system there is excellent. And they know that there will be bigger crowds. I've done the math on this. It's going to be 500% improvement over last fall. That's mathematical. This is why it's unhelpful that their multiple trips to Hamburg are often written about as if it was all one big experience. That's the sense you get from some documentaries or some quick summaries of their career. You get the feeling like, okay, there's just one big time in Hamburg. But in fact, they made multiple trips, and each trip was very different, really. And this is the benefit of our day-by-day immersion in the essence of the era, our longitudinal case analysis, walking in their Beatle boots, taking things in sequence. In other words, a year ago, I was one of those who ignorantly thought that the Hamburg thing was all one long trip, one long experience. And now I deeply understand how different the conditions are for this second trip and how they absolutely approached it with incredible confidence in themselves as entertainers. Compared with the Indra and the Kaiserkeller last year, this upcoming residency at the top 10 must have seemed to them as different as night and day, even now as they were preparing. And ready, Teddy, they would get. This is from the Barmy Beetle blog. I'm quoting Barmy here. On March 1st, 1961, Ellen Williams wrote a letter to the German consul in Liverpool to try to help Paul's and Pete's case, saying, "All the musicians have got good characters and come from first-class families, and they've never been in trouble with the police in this country." After taking care of Paul's and Pete's letters, Williams set out to make everything more official with authorities in both Liverpool and Hamburg. He got a license as a theatrical employment agent, which would have a look of importance to officials in Hamburg when they were perusing his contracts with Eckhorn. I'll put a link to the blog in the show notes. The Beatles' success as a live band in Liverpool between these residencies in Hamburg, it was huge. It was a confidence booster. They had an incredible number of bookings in February, 36 bookings. I mean, they were working 8 days a week. They were fully aware that they were hot stuff. Having already proven themselves as a live band, we know from primary sources that their next target was to make a record somehow. To have their sound well captured on vinyl was their dream, as Lewison put it. Now, they made themselves available live any time of day or night, so lunchtime shows and repeated overseas stays, hey, no problem. Yes, this was an edge over most other groups, but they already knew that they had a lot that competing groups lacked. That was no longer a question. Beyond basic competitiveness, they had practical reasons to wish for a bigger break. They needed to put their folks at ease, basically. I mean, it looked as though they could probably sustain themselves ongoing. They just needed a little more success. And so they were really eager to get back to Hamburg, to their stay at the top 10. And they had common reasons and they had individual reasons. Paul needed to get away from his dad for a while because he'd quit his job and Dad was like long-term pissed off. Stu had found, he came back for a month to Liverpool hoping to get things sorted with his school so he could do one more semester, and that went badly. So neither his school nor his family would really accommodate him in the ways he'd wished. He couldn't wait to get back to his happy life in Hamburg. George had just turned 18 finally, so he's eager to get back to Hamburg. And they were getting good support from the top 10 owner, Peter Eckhorn. They were getting help from Alan Williams. They were getting support from the German consulate in Liverpool. The contract was sorted. Alan licensed his business properly. They had all their papers in order, and they just had to get ready for the next month. And by the end of March, they're off. So to sum it all up, they were way more ready for St. Pauli in 1961 than in 1960. Last year, as you'll recall, they arrived exhausted in the wee hours of the morning, not knowing who to contact or where they were going to sleep. It was a city that had never been overseas before even. Now this year, they already know the club owner, Peter. He's already been decent to them, helpful for them. They already know the town, the Reeperbahn and Große Freiheit and other parts of Hamburg, wherever Astrid's mother's house was, I forget. And, they have local friends, Klaus, Astrid, Jürgen. And I guess now Stu you could count as another Hamburg local because he's had it with Liverpool. And as already mentioned, the club had a good sound system and they had decent beds upstairs for sleeping. The pay would be better, the crowds would be better, arrangements were better made, and everything was above board. And they just had this new confidence from all their, 8 days a week of gigging in Liverpool and being recognized in Liverpool and just getting the confidence together, maybe cockiness at this point. So in 1961, you can count on it. Hamburg is bound to be light years better than 1960 Hamburg, so we'll see. So, in the Facebook group, we follow a timeline. Every day is 60 years ago today. Have you seen those YouTube clips where they show a famous person's face morphing from like a baby to old age? Right? Morph, 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 and it keeps changing. Our project has a certain similarity, but it's very different. What's similar is that time moves in one direction, right? So we don't cover the Beatles back and forth in time, like we don't go Abbey Road and then back to Magical Mystery Tour and so on. We're going, each day becomes the next day, and we're currently in 1961 in March. Although I'm talking about February now, but we're in March when I'm making this podcast. And, tomorrow will be the next day of March, and then the next day of March, and so on. If you want to know exactly, it's March 6, 1961, and tomorrow is going to be March 7, Real time. We don't jump around. It's similar to those morphing videos in that time moves in one direction, but it's different in the pace of time. In those morphing videos, a year goes by in 1 or 2 seconds. In our group, a year goes by in a year. A month takes a month. A day takes a day. You get the picture? So, today is supposed to be exactly 60 years ago to the day. So if you're posting to us, you can post something from that day in 1961 or something farther into the past. We just don't post more recent history. So last month was February 1961. If you post something from Magical Mystery Tour, our admin is going to reject it because that's not 1961. You have to hold it for a few years. That rule applies only to new posts. In comments under posts, we're not following any timeline rule. So you can post something from this month in 1961, and then under that, post a video clip from Free as a Bird or whatever. Don't worry, it doesn't matter. The purpose of all this is to make the group easy to browse chronologically. You can go back to the summer last year, 1960, when they became Beatles with an A, and you can scroll posts in sequence up to wherever we are on the timeline. What some of us do is to keep a Google Calendar on our devices to make a note of when to post something later. You know, I might find a cool picture. I want to post it. Oh, but it's too recent. You know, it's from 1962. So I'll just find the place on my calendar, 1962. Okay, remember to post this photo this day, you know, and then when next year comes, that'll be ready. That's a memo to myself for next year. I have notes from now in 1961 all the way up to 1967, so some of that stuff is going to wait 6 or more years until I post. That's right, Magical Mystery Tour is more like 7 years from now, so... We've never been really explicit about what we see as the value of adhering to a day-to-day 60 years ago timeline. We've only said that it feels good when a post is on the same day 60 years ago. You know the feeling. Oh, wow, 60 years ago today. It's like an anniversary. It's special. We have to celebrate. And I know that that's not a deep enough explanation for those who are more research-minded. Loyal members and participants in the Beatle 60 project understand what's great about the pace, but none of us has put the pedagogical value into clear terms yet. And so let me see if I can define it more academically. I'm not trying to get too brainy here. And I hope that unpretentious listeners won't switch off at this point. Just, bear with me if you would. So, first of all, there's an aspect of this that's like what anthropologists do sometimes to try to take materials available to prehistoric humans and to replicate, for example, the crafting of stone tools. They're able to figure out how it was done, how useful the tools would be, and so on. Well, we're not physically driving to Litherland and playing the same instruments in front of warring teddy boys, but to immerse ourselves in the events of 1961 in context at a real-time pace in sequence, we deepen our interpretation of what went into their decisions. The Beatles are maybe the most written about people in the past century. At this point, they have, very little privacy left. We have this vast literature of the Fab's personalities. And following the case every day in sequence, we can almost get up in their minds. I mean, as incredible as that sounds, that's what we're sort of finding. For example, Paul deciding to quit Massey and Coggins, the timing of it, his delay in doing it, we know it was a difficult decision for him. And then finding that he needs to seek some distance from his dad, Jim, because of Jim's anger. It makes 100% sense if you're following this every day. Of course, we don't really know the Beatles as well as we think we do. Only they know them, and half of them have sadly passed. Our analytical takes on their experiences will be fallible. always fallible. All we can do is to make plausible guesses and test them on each other. And speaking for myself, since this is just a hobby, I don't really worry about what's 100% correct. I try to tolerate ambiguity, to say, we don't know. It simply means we don't know. The human species is wired to try to fill in the blanks when things are unknown. Isn't that true? But too much filling of blanks makes you like a conspiracy theorist. And there's a much easier, less troublesome option, and that is to leave the blanks blank for now, tolerating the fact that some things are unknown. That makes you more like a scientist. And none of us knows it all, and each of us is fallible. For us, in the group, all that matters is that we try to get it right. If we make an error, we don't dig in. It's really just the opposite. We love to get corrections. You notice, in other Facebook groups, you'll find, Mr. Know-It-All A comment warring against Mr. Know-It-All B, each one assuming for himself the role of the teacher and assuming that others are ignoramuses or whatever, Our group doesn't get that dynamic. I don't know why. Maybe we're too small. I hope it doesn't start happening as we grow. That dynamic would shut participation down. It's okay to know a lot. You can offer facts, perspectives, insights, and so on without taking the tone of a know-it-all. What we do differently is that we treat ourselves and each other as knowers who might know something, to have something to offer, have some insight that's worth hearing potentially. We're all students, that's what we say. There are no teachers, we're all fallible, we're all students. The focus is on the subject matter, not individuals. Okay, so let me expand on this practice of immersing ourselves in the essence of the era. It's 1961 in our timeline. Every 2 weeks I've been compiling a Spotify playlist of the best of the new singles 60 years ago that were entering the US and the UK top 100 charts. It's very interesting for me, learning a lot from doing that. And I'm also reading the New York Times from 1961 almost daily. And this approach follows the type of research performed, by writers of historical fiction. They immerse themselves in the era, diaries, artifacts, newspapers, art, food, etc. It would be even more informative to have archival copies of the Liverpool Echo. I'll leave that broad coverage to the real historians. I'm just another amateur historian who happened already to have a basic New York Times subscription. This archival thing comes with the basic subscription, so it's easy to check, and so I do. Again, this is just a hobby for us, so we don't invest too much time every day. It wouldn't be sustainable. We have jobs, we're not really historians. And, we get no return on investment of this time and effort other than, for me, it's collaborating with Grant to build a vibrant and smart Facebook group. That's my only aim, really. And other members know all sorts of things about 1961 that I never thought of. So together, we sort of crowdsource our 1961 immersion. And that's why we have a Facebook group. Everyone might have something to add. Maybe you're from Merseyside or from Hamburg, or maybe you remember 1961, or maybe you're a musician who's played at big shows and has made records. And even more likely, you might know the period in music very well and have a lot to tell us about what's happening there. So most of us have some kind of understanding to share, and that's what makes the group fun. Okay, now back to social science. In our group, we're not acting as scientists and we're not deliberately doing science, but there is a method of studying cases over time that is essentially what we're doing without naming it. I'm naming the method just now to explain the value of following the timeline, but this is not what we tell ourselves we're doing. It's the method of longitudinal case analysis, studying a case sequentially over the course of years. It allows us to see slow-moving causal mechanisms. This gives rise to this, that gives rise to that. X arising from Y. Grant noted to me privately the other day, I'm quoting him, "There's a rough through line to every post. I feel like we're compiling the ultimate source for a movie or a 10-season television series." End quote. So, dear listener, maybe you're skeptical, maybe you're thinking you could get this deep understanding simply by reading Tune In by Mark Lewis, and I might agree. We quote from him all the time. We need info after all, To get the same experience just from a book without using our group, you would have to read only a few paragraphs a day from multiple sources, all having to do at the same time period, and then stop reading and leave most of the day to reflect on what was happening. That would be almost the same, except we're doing it as a group activity, ongoing. Our slow pace and our discussions make this longitudinal case analysis possible, even though we just do it without naming the method. So, we have Facebook friends in Beatle groups and Facebook friends in non-Beatle groups. Cool folks all around, but in those Beatle groups, I have to say, half the fans treat the Fab Four's greatness and bestness as a new religion, which is ironic if you think about it. Bigger than Jesus. It's like a new orthodoxy where the fabled John, Paul, George, and Ringo are gods. That can be irritating. What's consistent in those groups is that the members keep reminding themselves that the Beatles were the greatest and the best and always will be the greatest and the best.
All glory and honor is yours forever and ever.
I don't believe in Beatles. Just believe in death.
And, not to sound too snobby, but our approach is just different, We're not too irreverent. It's just that we're focused on whatever went down 60 years ago, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's not really about worship. You can be in our group, even if you prefer the Rolling Stones, or Einstürzen der Neubauten, or Kendrick Lamar, or Lydia Lunch, or whoever. And even if you don't care what artists are the greatest or the best, you can join us, In those Beatle groups, people often start the Beatle timeline in 1962. Have you noticed that? Like time started in 1962. Is that true? I mean, not really. They became Beatles in 1960, so... Okay, sure, the enduring lineup of John, Paul, George, and Ringo starts when Ringo joins. And then they treat the next 8 years as one big jumble. But, the band has released no new product after 1970 aside from endless repackagings. How many times can you listen to Hey Jude and still hear it afresh? I know that my message here is repetitive, but just to summarize, we're a study group and not a fan group. It's an important distinction. And I think, for me, I already know the music from growing up in the 60s and 70s, but I don't really know their backstory, how it all really happened, and what it was like for them. I didn't read all the books, basically. I'm just starting now. It sounds strange that I would have this podcast and still be a sort of beginner, but I'm just beginning to learn about them. Sort of. What we're focused on in the Facebook group is our daily immersion in the timeline. And the time period exactly 60 years ago is currently 1961. We want to know how it happened, starting with John, Paul, George, Pete, and Stu. Now, the reason we focus on the Beatles is that there's just so much information. There's books and clips and interviews and media and artifacts. It's so rich. It's easy by focusing on the most popular group of the 60s, and it's fun. It really is. So why 60 years? It's because it brought us to the beginning of the Beatles, spelled with an A. It's just a nice even number, and it was a good year to go back to, so we thought we'd go back that far. Don't confuse this with nostalgia. Some people in the group are probably emotionally attached to childhood memories. All of us are susceptible to that. It's understandable, I suppose, but we can detach. I mean, time travel is cool in your imagination, but it feels more like we're just doing research. I mean, time keeps moving, even 60 years ago. In a few years, it'll be global mop tops, and after that, we're eventually going to get to psychedelia and swing in London and all that. It doesn't feel, stuck. It feels like constant, slow movement, like as the Earth travels around the sun, the past is not always so comforting either. Often we're learning about less appealing aspects of 60 years ago culture. All the violence they witnessed in Liverpool and Hamburg, for example. We're not seeking a familiar past for a sense of stability, although these days that would be nice if possible, There are so many Beatle fanatics on Facebook who seem to derive that sense of comfort through the stability and familiarity of nostalgia. And some seem to cling to reminders of childhood, like, you'll see people mixing Beatles and Snoopy Peanuts images, which is not an association I make, but, if that's what you're into, it's understandable. But yeah, it's not what we're doing. The Beatle 60 project is about learning, not comfort. We're not geniuses. I don't want to sound too dismissive, as if I'm so far beyond that, but also on Facebook, you have the type of Beatle fan who, for example, might own a collection of 20 vinyl copies of Band on the Run, all still sealed in the original plastic. These people have a lot of knowledge about pressings, and so that's something to add to our conversation. I don't know if we have people like that in our group. I have friends like that. I think what really looks different in our group is that many posts are from 60 years ago, but not necessarily Beatle related. We're not all Beatles, Beatles, Beatles. Often the topic is just 1961. 1961 as a more general context. And again, we're not all
Paul McCartney, Pete Best, Stuart Sutcliffe, George Harrison, John Winston Lennon,
but also Mona, Neil, Astrid, Klaus, Alan, et al. The main point here is that we're a learning community, not a fawning community. So what does it mean that participating members tend to know a lot? Well, there are so many Beatle books out there, and none of us has read them all. I've read very few, but each of us knows some different trivia, or we have backgrounds in music or performance and can relate. At very least, everyone has lived experience that can help us make sense of the context. For example, myself, in the early to mid-1960s, we all know that young adult hair lengths steadily grew each year. But I think elementary school kids younger than 12, still had kind of square hairstyles until around 1968. And I know that girls and boys both grew their hair longer around then. I was 7 at the time, and I remember the outside world wasn't ready for it. I remember the receptionist at the dental office, at the dentist, referred to me with a female pronoun somehow. Like, is she, does she have a toothache? Whatever. Asking my mother, and I would say, I'm a boy. I protested. And that's just one story from, someone of a particular age. And that story won't be useful until 5 years from now, because now we're in 1961. I don't remember. 60 years ago today, I was sentient, but not yet sapient. 1961, I was a baby. I was still in diapers, So, for now, we depend on first-hand stories from members in their 70s. And that's what's cool about Facebook groups, is that you get a wide range of ages among members. There are members of the group older than me by 10 or more years. And, if you're now in your mid-70s, you can tell us a lot about 60 years ago. Each member's date of birth actually will affect how he or she will experience our timeline. It's great to have all those lived experiences to draw on. I'm tempted to ask members under 60 to tell us when is the date when they turn 60 so we can put it in the timeline, but I don't know, that would be awkward to manage and kind of invasive, right? So, Anyway, it would be interesting to hear from those who are turning 3 or 4 years old 60 years ago and are starting to remember things that we're covering in the timeline. Briefly, some podcast notes. This podcast reviews what we covered in the Facebook group in the past month. That's why I'm uploading the February episode, and it's already March. Please note that the group is where the action is. It's right up to date every day. Lots of fun people, are good friends, lively. You're going to like it if you join, so go ahead and join. If this sounds like your thing, it's your thing. This podcast, honestly, though, compared to the group, this podcast is where the action isn't. I'm just summarizing. I'm reviewing the past month. And to tell you the absolute honest truth, this is for outreach. That's why we have this, drawing folks into the group. To find us on Facebook, first go to your groups page. Then search within groups for Beatles 60 years ago today. So if you go to the groups section, groups has its own search, So you search within groups for Beatles 60 years ago today. Okay. Consider that the Beatles almost sacked Paul as early as 1961. Yeah, it's true. Ray at the Cavern was finding it difficult to book them for lunchtime gigs, even though he and all the Beatles knew that it was a win-win-win-win-win-win-win situation. The obstacle? Paul's day job. Winding coils, whatever he was doing. And over the phone, John gave Paul an ultimatum. Either fucking turn up today, or you're not in the group anymore. Either come or you're out. It really could have ended there. Paul could have decided, no, I'm staying with Massey and Coggins. Paul's relationship with his dad, Jim, was nothing like John's relationship with his Aunt Mimi, where John freely pushed his way around. Paul was more obedient, respectful, I suppose. Paul hated to disappoint Jim, On the phone with John, he obviously didn't promise either way. There was hesitation. And Paul finally decides to quit the day job, disappoint Jim, and throw in fully with the Beatles. And this hesitation shows us that he cared about his dad. And the decision clearly indicates that there's confidence in what the Beatles were doing and how they were doing and what they were made of and what their potential seemed to be. That's, that would take, it must have been really hard for him to make that decision. So just something to reflect on. If Beatlemania had started in Litherland, the mania on their many return gigs there in early 1961 would surely build the Beatles' confidence. There was some sort of raffle at one gig there in February. The raffle was apparently for the girls only. The winning prize was the chance to be kissed by Paul. Mark Lewison describes it. When she went on stage, dozens of others rushed up as well, squealing and shoving, and amid the pandemonium, John somehow ended up on the floor. Brian Kelly's bouncers had to rescue them, and Bob Buller closed the curtains until calm was restored. It was quite a moment. And, okay, so my reaction to this is, what? Tell me this didn't go to Paul's head. I mean, maybe this gave him the confidence to quit his day job, Maybe that was it. Now, I won't go over everything that went wrong for Stuart on his trip back to Liverpool, but briefly, that's worth covering. His mom refused to host Astrid. He and Astrid had to stay with Alan and Beryl Williams, which was probably, better for them anyway. But then his negotiations with the art school went all wrong, and that was his only purpose for returning to Liverpool to start with. So from the sound of it, he enjoyed being in Liverpool with Astrid for the first time and rejoining the Beatles, but everything else about the trip sucked for Stuart. And it sounds like he was suffering from myriad physical and mental health problems at the time. And mostly it manifested itself in anger. And we learned that Stu was stylish, deep, and angry. Or he could be angry, And for a recommendation, he went to a former tutor who felt that Stuart shouldn't have been considering a teacher's diploma anyway. And I'll quote, "It would have been no good for him as an artist and frustrating for him as a person." If you feel like crying at this point, it's understandable. His trip home had some high points, but deep, deep lows. It was mostly tragic. And before February was through, he just wanted to retreat to Hamburg and get back to painting and spending time alone with Astrid in their comfortable space. Would it be less depressing if we could focus on how cool Stu and Astrid were? Maybe. So, all right, let's indulge. Stuart's cool is ageless late 20th century. If he'd been born 20 years later, he could have been a goth. Or what are they called? He could have been emo? Probably. He could have been post-punk, surely. I mean, if Peter Hook's bass lines remained intact, but you visually replaced him with Stuart Sutcliffe in Joy Division, he would fit in seamlessly. He would have looked the part. Or just looking at rock coupledom in general, with Astrid and him wearing each other's clothes. You think of Keith and Anita in 1968, or maybe John and Yoko in 1970, or Ziggy and Angie in 1972, or Sid and Nancy in 1978. And when Astrid arrived to join him in Liverpool at the beginning of February, she just seemed to create a beautiful atmosphere around the two, impressing not only the Beatles, but the whole Jacaranda philosophizing round table of friends, John Lennon, Bill Harry, and Rod Murray, as they welcomed her and welcomed Stu back. Mark Lewison writes, meeting in the Jacaranda, Bill Harry found them both white as a sheet and dressed in black. Stuart struck Bill as more intense than ever, discussing philosophy and reading Kierkegaard. Rod Murray couldn't have been happier for his best friend. Astrid was pretty and really avant-garde. She and Stuart looked exotic in their black leather, and he was obviously happy. I thought, what a lucky guy. Well, let's linger on Slater Street for a moment. Jacaranda owner and former Beatles manager Alan Williams still was in the lives of the Beatles, just more peripheral than central. Now I'm quoting Grant. Despite doing so much for them in 1960, Alan Williams hadn't provided them with any other bookings in the 3 months since they returned. Going off of his quote, I think this is because he tried building that one club that was all built of wood and it burned down the first night. Anyway, I think that he was really distracted by that. Anyway, this isn't to say that Williams had done very little. It was he who'd advised Bob Wooler to find the bookings. This is quoting Grant. And it was also Williams who had his secretary type up Pete and Paul's statements of appeal for the German authorities, post them off in what John Lennon called a stabbed undressed envelope, and assist them in their efforts to return to Hamburg in the spring. It was also Williams who had put Stu and Astrid up in his home after Stu's falling out with his mother. So, despite not always actively finding bookings for them, Williams was still very much a part of the Beatles' lives. Now, Ray at the Cavern had Bob Wooler in charge of making lunchtime gigs happen, and Wooler booked the usual Derry and the Seniors, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, Jerry and the Pacemakers, fresh back from Hamburg. The Big Three, formerly known as Cass and the Casanovas, but now without Cass, and the Beatles. As intended, the lunchtime rock brought in a younger crowd for the Cavern, ages 15 and up. And this young crowd, although still predominantly working class, were city centre workers, slightly more worldly than the Teds who the Beatles played for in the outer towns like Aintree and Litherland. It was an audience well matched with the Beatles, and the network they would build here in the centre of the city would serve them well. Take this, brother. 15 sounds young for a day worker going to a club, but it was normal there and then. And consider this, these kids would turn 20 right around 1966, Never mind Meet the Beatles, it's more like Beatles Meet Your Future Target Audience. It's as if everything they did turned out right. It was a real win-win-win-win-win-win for everyone. Mark Lewison interviewed a woman named Beryl Johnson, no relation to Beryl Williams. Well, they're both named Beryl. And she, at the age of 15 in 1961, saw the Beatles in Aintree and became the group's first follower. Beryl says, "When I heard they were playing at the Cavern, I pretended to have a dentist appointment and rushed down there. I ended up having loads of dentist appointments, much to my mother's annoyance. That first lunchtime, the place was half empty, and I sat on the front row with my feet up on the stage and talked to them in between songs." I think I just really butchered the Scouse accent there. And you're welcome to complain. Let me know. I'm going to describe a couple of photos from February. I know that it's a goofy thing to do on an audio podcast, but you can see these two photos in the Facebook group. I'll put links in the show notes. Now, we're quoting to Mark Lewis, and from one of their two February Cavern gigs, a single black and white photograph has survived. It's the only known picture of the Beatles at the Cavern in this period. And you see that John has a splint protecting his broken finger. And yeah, Stu is in the background. And the photographer is unknown. So you can have a look at that. And the other photo is a photo that Mike McCartney took of Stu and Astrid with John on the street in Liverpool. And Stu and Astrid looking timelessly avant-garde. And John looking a little bit like Bob Dylan. Of course, nobody in England had heard of Bob Dylan yet, and nobody in New York had heard of the Beatles. But see the show notes for links to these images. I want to leave you all with a mystery that you can probably solve. I'm too busy or maybe too lazy. Stu had this huge bass amp when they were at the Kaiserkeller. What happened to that? Didn't he bring it to Liverpool? Maybe he didn't. I know it's a nerdy detail, but I want to know. So, in the Mersey beat, Bill Harry quoted Rod of Wump and his Werbles, saying that they'd played on a bill in Seaforth at Latham Hall with the Beatles, and they let the Beatles borrow their brand new Selmer True Voice Selectatone amp, only to discover that Stu had plugged his bass into it and it was bouncing all over the place. Where was his giant amp? That's what I want to know. I want to know. Inquiring minds want to know. And that's all for this month. You can find our various web things by search in Google or Facebook or Spotify. And just remember to put no space between Beatles and the numerals 60. It's Beatle 60, not Beatles 60. It's Beatle 60. And to find the group, I just want to emphasize again, first go to your group's main page on Facebook, then search Beatles 60 years ago today. You can leave a voice message for me through the Anchor app. See the link in the show notes. In the app, you can just tap a button and leave a voice message. It's very easy. Or contact the Beatle 60 team on Facebook. We have no email and no Twitter, but you can reach both Grant and me by messaging to the Beatle 60 Facebook page. And we'll link that in the show notes too. So until next month, bye.